killed Elvis Presley?
No, drugs had nothing to do with his death.
Absolutely nothing.
Nothing. That was proven and shown in my book.
On a stainless steel tray under harsh white lab lights, a small plastic tube sits almost quietly, as if it does not understand the weight of history it carries. Inside that tube, curled and fragile, are a few dark strands that once rested on the head of Elvis Presley. For decades, fans have chased jumpsuits, signed records, and ticket stubs. Yet these brittle pieces of hair may hold something far more powerful than any collectible. A silent record of what was happening inside his body in the months before everything ended. Scientists do not see relics when they look at those strands. They see data. Hair is a timeline that grows out of the body, carrying with it traces of stress, chemicals, and illness. Each millimeter is a memory the bloodstream left behind. When the team accepted this sample, they understood that they were not simply handling a famous man's hair. They were about to read a biological diary written in keratin, month by month, as Elvis tried to carry the weight of a legend on a body that was clearly struggling. The world already knows the surface story of his final years. The swollen photographs, the exhausted performances, the cruel jokes whispered about his weight and his dependence on prescription pills have been replayed for more than 4 decades. Newspapers covered his death at 42 with lurid headlines, then moved on. The myth of Elvis turned his last chapter into a cautionary tale, a quick summary of excess and collapse. Lost beneath that noise was a very human question that never fully went away. What was really happening to him from the inside out? AQ. That question is what brought this particular tube into a modern laboratory. The hair did not appear out of nowhere. Years earlier, during one of those late career trims when Elvis still insisted on looking like Elvis, a trusted hand swept clippings from the floor. Most went into the trash. A small portion did not. Someone who had watched him up close, someone who had seen the sweat, the tremor in his hands, the glassy stare after yet another long night, decided to keep a few strands in a plain envelope. At the time, it felt less like a plan and more like an instinct, a way of holding on to the man behind the posters. That envelope changed owners over the years, quietly and without fanfare. While other locks of hair appeared at auctions and in glossy displays, this one stayed off stage. It passed from one private drawer to another, protected by a mixture of reverence and unease. The people who held it knew they possessed something intimate. They could not quite explain why they never sold it. They only knew that it did not feel right to turn this particular piece of Elvis into a bidding war. Time moved on. Biographies appeared. Conspiracy theories multiplied. Some insisted that his death had been exaggerated, that he had disappeared to escape the circus. Others argued about the role of his doctor, his handlers, and the punishing schedule that kept him on the road when he clearly needed rest. Through all of this, that small envelope remained sealed. The story of his final years stayed cloudy, built on conflicting autopsy details, interviews, and half-remembered anecdotes. There were opinions everywhere, but there was very little new evidence. Eventually, the person who held the envelope grew older and more reflective. Curiosity began to outweigh hesitation. Modern science had advanced far beyond anything available in 1977. Toxicology techniques could now detect medication levels, heavy metals, and stress markers preserved in hair long after the body was laid to rest. The choice no longer felt like exploitation. It felt like an opportunity to finally listen to what his body had been trying to say all along. With that in mind, the envelope was opened, the strands were transferred into a marked tube, and Elvis's hair left the world of private memorabilia and entered the world of clinical investigation. In the lab, the contrast could not be sharper. Fans see those strands as sacred, almost holy, something to frame or protect. The scientists handling them wear gloves, masks, and neutral expressions. They label, measure, and log every step. To them, this is not an icon. It is a sample with a chain of custody, a specimen that must be processed correctly if any conclusion is going to stand up to scrutiny. The reverence has not disappeared, it has simply changed form. Respect now means precision instead of worship. Preliminary tests begin. Microscopic examination confirms the hair's age and condition. Basic screening checks for contamination. Everything looks consistent with a sample from the era in question. Then the team starts the work that truly matters. Preparing the hair for segmented analysis, slicing it into tiny sections that represent different periods in the months before his death. Each slice will be examined for chemical signatures. An invisible map of what flowed through his bloodstream as the world kept demanding encores and tours. As early readings flicker onto computer screens, a quiet shift moves through the lab. Certain levels appear higher than expected. Certain combinations of substances show up together in ways that make experienced eyes tighten. The data is not yet complete, and no one is ready to speak publicly, but the pattern forming in front of them does not match the simple story that has been told again and again. It hints at something more complex, more troubling, and perhaps more heartbreaking than the familiar tale of a superstar who simply went too far. Faced with that possibility, the team makes a decision. Initial screens will not be enough. They will move forward with deeper, more advanced tests, the kind that can reconstruct a timeline of exposure and stress in fine detail. Once those results are in, they may confirm the long-held suspicions of devoted fans, or they may expose new failures in the way Elvis was treated by the people around him. Either way, those fragile strands of hair are about to speak louder than any rumor or headline ever has. For the scientists, the hair begins its story in the lab. For the person who first swept it from a barbershop floor, the story began much earlier, in a cramped room thick with hairspray and anxiety, somewhere behind on the public glow of a late-career Elvis tour. He had come in for what was supposed to be a simple touch-up, one more trim to keep the world believing in the image it had fallen in love with. Up close, that image already showed cracks. His skin looked tired. Movements felt slower. The laughter that used to fill every room came out thinner, as if even joy now had to fight its way through exhaustion. The barber had cut his hair many times over the years. By that point, the routine almost ran itself. Cape around his shoulders, comb through the dark waves, a few quiet jokes, the low murmur of trusted voices in the background. Still, something about this particular visit felt different. Elvis's eyes did not sparkle with the same mischief. His questions came out of habit rather than interest. When he leaned forward, the barber could feel the weight of a man who seemed older than the number on his passport. Once the cut was done, clippings were brushed from his neck. The cape was removed, and he stepped back into the role of Elvis Presley, ready to face lights and crowds again. When the door closed behind him, the barber stared at the pile of hair on the floor. Most days he would have swept it up and thought nothing of it. This time he paused. Those dark strands belonged to a man the world thought it knew, yet every private moment hinted at a much more fragile reality. With a strange mixture of impulse and reverence, he gathered a small portion of the clippings and slipped them into an envelope. He told himself it was just a souvenir, a personal keepsake of a client who had become a kind of friend. Deep down, it felt like an instinct to hold on to the version of Elvis that only a few people ever saw. Years rolled forward. The world treated Elvis's memory like a never-ending marketplace. There were auctions where rhinestone jumpsuits sold for staggering sums. Scarves he had thrown from the stage were framed like holy relics. Locks of hair, some genuine and some questionable, made their way into display cases and private vaults. Collectors boasted about owning pieces of the man, as if touching a part of him could pull them closer to the myth. In the middle of that frenzy, the old envelope remained hidden. The barber, and later the family member who inherited it, turned down offers whenever the subject came up. They could not imagine watching those strands go under a hammer while strangers lifted numbered paddles. During that same period, the story of Elvis's last years hardened into a familiar shape. Biographies repeated the official details, the grueling schedule, the dependence on prescription medication, the bathroom where his life ended too soon. Documentaries added dramatic music, but rarely new insight. Some painted him as a man who lost control, overwhelmed by his own appetites. Others hinted at darker forces, suggesting that people around him had used his body as a resource until it gave out. As the work continues, the team looks beyond drug levels. They search for broader signs of stress and vulnerability. Some markers hint at a body under chronic pressure, a system that never fully resets. There are indications that his cardiovascular health may have been compromised long before the final crisis. Nothing here is so simple as a single smoking gun, yet the pattern is undeniable. It is the profile of a man who was not simply tired or out of shape. His physiology was fighting a multi-front battle, against the demands of performance, against underlying weaknesses, and against the accumulated burden of the medications meant to keep him functional. The more data they gather, the harder it is to keep the questions at arm's length. If these patterns are visible now from a few strands of hair, what signs were visible then to the people physically in the room with him? How many times did he walk onto a stage with a bloodstream already crowded with pills that should have been used sparingly, if at all, in combination? Did anyone around him sit down with numbers like these, or did they rely on quick examinations and reassurances that his body could take a little more? The scientists are careful not to assign legal blame. That is not their role. Still, they cannot ignore the uncomfortable overlap between what the hair shows and what the historical record suggests. There are documented concerts where fans noticed that his words blurred, that he seemed to drift, that he forgot lyrics he had sung thousands of times. There are interviews where his gaze looks distant, where his responses feel delayed. When the team lines up those moments with the approximate periods represented in the hair, the alignment is eerie. The data and the memories point in the same direction. He was struggling in plain sight. Outside this lab, it has always been convenient to say that he did this to himself, that he chose excess, that he ignored warnings. The hair complicates that narrative. It suggests a situation that evolved over time, with layers of dependence and medical decisions that would be questioned fiercely by today's standards. It points to an environment where the easiest answer to pain, exhaustion, or anxiety was another pill rather than canceled shows and prolonged rest. Personal responsibility does not disappear, but it no longer stands alone. The picture looks less like a single man spiraling and more like a system that kept feeding a cycle because too many people were invested in keeping the machine running. As the final charts are assembled, one thought hangs over the team more than any other. Those elevated levels and dangerous combinations did not appear in his body overnight. They built up over weeks and months. That means there were windows where someone could have stepped in, recalibrated his treatment, or insisted on a different path. The hair makes that impossible to deny. It shows that his body had been waving red flags long before his heart finally gave out. In the quiet of the lab, surrounded by graphs and samples, the realization settles in. The tragedy of Elvis Presley's final days may not be that no one knew he was in trouble, but that too many people saw the signs and kept going anyway. News of the analysis does not break like a scandal. It seeps into the world in fragments. A headline here, a podcast there, a quiet discussion in fan forums where people have been defending or grieving Elvis for most of their lives. At first, the hair test sounds like a curiosity, another strange detail in a story that already feels crowded with trivia. Then people begin to understand what the scientists actually found. These are not rumors, these are measurements. These are numbers that show what his body was enduring month after month. Among fans, reactions split in complicated ways. Some feel a deep sense of confirmation. For years, they insisted that Elvis was not simply reckless or careless, that there was more going on than personal weakness and appetite. When they read that his hair shows sustained exposure to powerful medications and signs of chronic strain, they feel as if the man they loved has finally been heard. Others feel protective and uneasy. Turning his suffering into charts and graphs feels invasive. They worry that the findings will be twisted into new headlines that once again reduce him to a punchline about fried food and pills. The analysis forces a new conversation that is not easily dismissed. Elvis has long been treated as a cautionary story told in a single breath. Too famous, too rich, too out of control. The hair tells a slower story. It speaks of a body that was asked to carry a schedule designed for a machine, not a human being. It points to a life where rest became a luxury and medication turned into infrastructure. When you see his final months in that light, the old jokes about him become harder to repeat. They begin to sound like mockery of someone who had been running on empty for far longer than anyone wanted to admit. This shift in perspective changes how people talk about responsibility. Blame is easy when it is placed entirely on the shoulders of the man who took the pills. The hair suggests a wider circle. Managers who kept booking shows, insurers who needed tours to go on, doctors who wrote prescriptions, and an entire system that profited every time he walked onto a stage all become part of the frame. No single chart accuses any one person by name. The evidence simply makes it harder to pretend that his decline was a private failure that happened in isolation. In that sense, the findings do not only belong to the past. The pattern looks disturbingly familiar when you compare it to more recent stories of artists who collapsed under the weight of their own careers. Different eras, different genres, but the same basic shape. A gifted person, a demanding industry, a body that keeps getting patched with chemicals instead of being allowed to heal. Elvis, once presented as the first great cautionary tale of modern celebrity, begins to look like the prototype of something that has repeated again and again across the decades. Fans who have followed his story since childhood feel the weight of that connection. They remember seeing those final photographs and being told that this was the result of indulgence, laziness, or lack of discipline. The hair offers another portrait. It shows a man whose bloodstream had become a battlefield, a place where relief and damage arrived in the same pill bottle. Behind the glitter and the jumpsuit stood a human being trying to meet every demand placed upon him, even when his body no longer could. That realization carries a mixture of sadness and reluctant admiration. He kept showing up when many others would have fallen long before. As the implications sink in, the conversation around his legacy begins to shift. The question is no longer simply how he died, but how he was allowed to live in those last years. What kind of culture treats its brightest star as a resource to be managed until the very last drop of energy is gone? How many people looked at him and saw not a struggling man, but a contract, a tour schedule, a paycheck? The hair does not give those answers. It only makes the questions impossible to ignore. A quiet, more personal reckoning happens as well. For some, the new information softens the harsh judgments they once held. It becomes harder to scold a man for not taking better care of himself when you see how complex his situation had become. Layers of duty, loyalty, fear, and dependency all wound around each other. The hair reminds everyone that beneath the legend, Elvis Presley was someone whose heart, liver, nerves, and lungs could only withstand so much pressure and so much chemistry before they began to fail. In the end, the sample that arrived in the lab as a curiosity leaves behind something deeper. It gives Elvis a measure of dignity in truth. Not the polished truth of publicity, not the distorted truth of gossip, but the blunt truth of what his body carried. Knowing that does not erase the music, the charisma, or the joy he brought to millions. It adds a layer beneath them, a recognition that the price he paid was higher than most people understood when they clapped and cheered. When the work is done and the machines are quiet, the hair returns to its tube. The scientists file their reports. Screens go dark. Outside the lab, life moves on, as it always does. Yet for those who have followed his story, the image lingers. A few strands of dark hair, once swept from a barbershop floor, now revealed as the clearest witness to the final chapter of Elvis Presley's life. That witness has said everything it can. The rest is up to the people who choose what to remember, what to change, and how to speak about the man behind the myth. If this closer look at Elvis's final months changed how you see him, stay with this channel. Here, legends are not gossip. They are human stories in full. Subscribe, share this video with another fan, and tell us in the comments what this new evidence means to you.